welcome to the deep dive.
Hello.
So we've got a whole collection of sources here, things like field notes, some historical accounts, detailed geological surveys.
Right, and they all seem to point towards this one single, pretty fascinating location.
Yeah, it's a spot where the story, well, it stretches from the literal formation of mountains millions of years ago.
All the way through ancient human history and even up to, how modern borders got drawn. Geopolitics.
So our mission really is to take all this raw material and try and piece together the incredible story of this place, pull out the most important bits, the surprising connections.
And whether you need this for something specific or you're just curious, we're aiming to cut through the noise for you.
Get to what's really interesting, what's relevant in these documents.
Let's jump in.
Okay, so first off, based on these accounts, your initial impression of this area could be, well, kind of misleading.
Oh, how so?
There's one description recommending a route, sounds lovely, through a beautiful wadi, just a kilometer in.
Okay, sounds nice.
But then you read another note about a different walk, the Zatu Ramon walk, and it's described like deadpan, as being less interesting than a phone book.
Wow, okay. Quite the contrast.
Right. And the field notes, they immediately flag some practical stuff, safety concerns.
Like what?
Things like, watch out for falling stones, be aware of people below you.
Standard stuff for that kind of terrain, I guess.
And honestly, just the basic need to help each other out. It's tough country.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. Looks barren, maybe, but there are real dangers.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit, because the ground itself here, the geology, tells this incredibly ancient story.
It really does. The surveys lay out basically three main types of rock making up the landscape.
Right, what are they?
Okay, so deepest down, the oldest stuff, you've got igneous rock, formed from cooling magma.
Good.
An example mentioned is from the Har and Varish area, way back in the Precambrian, ancient.
Got it. Then above that.
Above that is a layer of continental sedimentary rock, things like sandstone. The notes mention seeing this really clearly in the Red Canyon area.
Sandstone, okay. And the top layer.
And then capping it all off, the youngest layer is marine sedimentary rock.
Formed underwater.
Exactly. When the whole area was sea, we're talking dolomite, limestone, chalk, flint. All those are mentioned as examples.
So let's, rewind the clock on this place. Where does the geological story actually begin?
It kicks off around 900 million years ago, formation of something called the Nubian Arabic Massif.
Oh, 900 million.
Yeah. And then, amazingly, around 870 million years ago, the sources say this entire region was covered by sea.
That's when that top marine layer got laid down.
That's right. And roughly the same time, you get this massive collision. The Arab-Nubian Massif slams into what becomes the Congo Massif in Africa.
Okay, huge forces involved.
Immense pressure. It crushes and changes the existing rock, metamorphosing it into schist.
It's schist, okay.
Then, fast forward a bit, maybe 700 million years ago, you get magma, molten rock, pushing up from deep inside the earth, intruding into the layers already there. And then another collision happens. The schist, it couldn't really change much more, but this newer magmatic rock, under all that pressure, it gets metamorphosed into gneiss.
Nice. How's that different?
Known for its larger, coarser crystals. You can tell the difference.
Okay, so multiple rounds of pressure and heat.
Exactly. Now, skip ahead again to around 600 million years ago. The surveys show another period of magmatic intrusion.
Or magma pushing up.
Yeah, but this time, crucially, there wasn't that same intense pressure, so the rock cooled and hardened, but it didn't metamorphose.
Ah, okay. So it stayed as igneous rock.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And you can see examples today, the sources say, in places like Mount Shu, Mount Shrimo, and in the canyon at Helmel.
It's amazing to think how this magma even forms. The notes talk about that.
You do, yeah. It happens like 5 to 7 kilometers down. The temperature gradient means it gets incredibly hot down there. We're talking 1,300 degrees Celsius for the magma.
Wow.
And how fast it cools makes a difference to the crystals. Slower cooling, like in bigger pockets of magma, means bigger crystals form.
Makes sense.
And they also mentioned dikes. These are like vertical cracks where magma pushed up when the crust was actually stretching, pulling apart, not being squeezed.
So the Earth is constantly shifting, squeezing or stretching.
That's the picture you get, yeah.
Okay, so bringing us much closer to today. How did the landscape we actually see now form?
Right, that really kicked off around 25 million years ago. There was significant uplift.
Uplift.
Yeah, areas like Mount Timna got pushed upwards, caused by faults linked to the big Syrian African rift. It literally carried these older rock layers up on its shoulders, so to speak.
Lifted the whole stack up.
Exactly. And then over millions of years, erosion takes over. Ancient rivers, what they call wadis today, carved down through these uplifted areas.
And that's what exposed the different layers.
That's exactly it. It created this amazing cross-section view. You can see now the ancient igneous rock down low, the sandstones in the middle, and that marine layer capping the tops.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, I think. All that geology, the faulting, the erosion, it made something really valuable accessible to ancient people.
Let me guess. Copper.
Copper. Exactly. The material specifically points out a significant horizontal layer of copper ore right here.
Ah, okay. So the geology directly leads to the human story.
Straight into it. You immediately see the link in the archaeology. The records describe finding a mining area and also a temple.
A temple again, yeah. Dating back to when?
Late Bronze Age. Specifically around 1300 BCE. That's before Common Era, of course.
1300 BCE. Okay, so who was running the show back then?
According to the historical accounts, the Egyptians. This area was clearly under their influence, maybe direct control.
Right, New Kingdom Egypt was powerful then, and the evidence linking them.
The main thing is this Temple of Hathor they found.
Hathor, she's a major Egyptian goddess, right?
Yeah, but what's fascinating is her, list of domains. Music, dance, beauty, cosmetics,
Okay.
and mining.
Mining, that's an
Yeah.
unusual mix.
Isn't it? But it perfectly explains why you'd find a temple to her right next to a major copper mine. They even found her image drawn on the temple wall.
Wow. And the temple itself, what was it like?
Pretty typical for the region and time, apparently. Small inner room, maybe just for a priest, and then a larger courtyard.
Okay. But the sources mention it wasn't just the Egyptians.
No, exactly. Later on, the records talk about the Midianites showing up.
Midianites. They figure in the Bible, don't they?
They do. Think Moses, his father-in-law Jethro, wife Zipporah, all connected to Midian.
Right. And what did they do at the temple site?
Well, they altered it. They actually erased Hathor's image.
Oh, okay. So replacing the Egyptian influence.
Seems like it.
Well-
And they built their own religious structure, standing stones, called metzivit. So you see this transition or maybe overlap of cultures happening right there.
Fascinating. And this was all about the copper.
Absolutely. Remember, this is the Bronze Age. Copper wasn't just, useful metal. It was power. The sources literally describe it as bank.
Because bronze, the key alloy for tools and weapons, is mostly copper.
Yeah, about 85% copper mixed with tin. If you control the copper source, you controlled immense economic and military power.
And the archaeology backs this up. Lots of finds.
Oh yeah, Benno Rothenberg, who excavated there decades ago, found something like 10,000 votive gifts.
10,000 offerings left at the temple.
Exactly. Things like scarabs, those little Egyptian amulets, and tons of copper items.
Makes sense.
There's even a specific mention of a copper snake artifact being found.
A copper snake. The sources note that might connect to a biblical story, right?
They do mention a potential link, yeah. Interesting little detail.
Okay, so putting this all together, the story of who was actually mining here and when they were doing it, it sounds like that understanding has shifted over time.
Oh, massively. It's a fantastic example of how history isn't static. It evolves as we find new stuff.
Right. So what was the initial idea?
The sources start with the view largely set by Nelson Gluck back in the 1930s. He looked at the major sites and dated them to the time of King David and Solomon.
Okay, so around 1000 BCE, the Israelite kingdom.
That was the idea, but that view got seriously challenged later on.
By who? Rothenberg again?
Primarily, yeah, through his excavations. He pointed out a couple of things. First, he found very little that was specifically Jewish or Hebrew at the sites Gluck linked to Solomon.
Okay, lack of definitive evidence.
Right. And second, the biblical texts themselves seem to place Solomon's main copper operations somewhere else, more like the Jordan Valley, not down here.
Interesting discrepancy.
But the biggest thing, the real clincher, was the dating of the temple finds.
Those 10,000 items.
Exactly. They were clearly dated to the Egyptian New Kingdom period, specifically 1400 down to about 1150 BCE.
Okay, wait. That's centuries before Solomon.
Exactly. Centuries earlier.
So that completely undercut Gluck's theory.
Pretty much. The documents are actually quite blunt about it. They say the older consensus, which held until around 2010, is now seen as pure nonsense.
Strong words. Okay, so the Egyptians were definitely there earlier.
Yes. But then, things got even more complex with newer discoveries.
Oh.
Work by Ellis Yosef and others. They found older Edomite sites, but dating nomadic cultures in the desert is really tricky. It raised questions about timelines like, if David had garrisons in Edom around 1000 BCE, but the oldest Edomite sites found seem to date later, maybe 7th century BCE. It gets complicated.
Right, matching archaeology to historical texts isn't always straightforward.
Definitely not. But the real turning point, the thing mentioned prominently in the sources, came from one specific site, Fanon Site 30.
Fanon 30, what did they find there?
Hundreds of ancient seeds, things like dates, olives, some of the 7 species mentioned in the Bible.
Wow, organic material, that usually doesn't survive well.
Not usually, but here it did. And crucially, they could use modern carbon dating on them.
Ah, C14 dating. That's a game changer compared to just pottery styles.
Totally.
Yeah.
The sources call it the DNA of a site, and the results from Funan.
What did they show?
They dated squarely to the 10th century DCE.
The 10th century. Wait, that's Solomon's time again?
Exactly. So this flipped the script again. The current understanding, based on this post-2010 evidence in the sources, is, yes, the Egyptians were involved earlier, maybe on a smaller scale, but the major period of production, the big industrial-scale copper extraction, actually happened right in the 10th century BCE, Solomon's era.
Huh. So Glucka wasn't entirely wrong, just maybe, about who was doing the work.
That seems to be the nuance, yeah. It might not have been Solomon's Israelites doing the digging themselves.
So who then? Locals, Edomite.
Could have been locals, yeah. Edomites or others, maybe operating under Solomon's economic influence or control, like they paid tribute or trade the copper.
Right. The analogy in the material is like Mexico mining today, and maybe Israel gets a dividend or benefits from the trade.
Exactly that analogy. So it's complex. Egyptians early, massive production in Solomon's time, but maybe by proxy, and then others later.
It really shows how much carbon dating revolutionized archaeology since, what, the late 1940s?
Absolutely. Compared to older methods, like just looking at pottery styles, it's much more precise.
And it fits with a broader shift in archaeology too, doesn't it?
How so?
Moving beyond just, who was king here, to understanding daily life. What did ordinary people eat? What did they wear? How did they actually do the work?
Yes, definitely. And Timna is apparently amazing for that.
Because of the preservation.
Exactly. The extreme dryness preserved organic stuff incredibly well. Food remains, fragile bits of cloth like argament fabric.
Stuff archaeologists almost never get to see.
Right. It lets them study the details of daily life in a way that's almost unmatched anywhere else from that period.
And they found things like Mediterranean fish remains way out there in the desert.
Yeah. Which is surprising, right? It suggests the workers weren't maybe just disposable slaves if someone's importing food for them from that far away.
Interesting. Shows a certain level of provisioning or care.
Okay, let's dive into that work itself. How did they actually get the copper out of the rock and turn it into metal?
Right, the actual process. The documents detail the mining technique first. They'd follow that horizontal copper layer.
The one exposed by the geology.
Yeah, and dig shafts into it to get the ore out.
Simple enough, but hard work.
Very. And there's a fascinating insight from just looking at the tool marks left on the rock walls.
Tool marks, what did they show?
Well, some marks are described as dots. These were left by using basic stone hammers.
Okay, Stone Age tech.
Right, and using stone hammers meant the shafts they dug were kind of shallow and wide because you're basically chipping away lots of rock inefficiently.
Got it. Dots mean stone hammers. What else?
Other marks are described as stripes. These were made by chisel.
Chisels, which you'd need metal to make, presumably.
Exactly. Metal tools. Copper or bronze chisels.
Ah, so the tool marks themselves show a technological leap.
Precisely. That difference between dots and stripes is pivotal. It marks humanity moving from stone tools to metal ones, from the Stone Age into the next era, Chalcolithic, Bronze Age.
Wow. Tangible evidence of them using the very copper they were mining to make better tools to mine more copper.
It's a perfect feedback loop, yeah. Using copper to get more copper.
Okay, so they've mined the ore. What about turning it into actual metal? Smelting.
Right, the smelting process was incredibly complex. Based on the descriptions, they'd build furnaces.
What are they like?
Often partially dug into the ground for insulation maybe, and then built up with clay. And they needed fuel. Lots of it.
Wood?
Charcoal, actually. They'd convert wood into charcoal because it burns much hotter, gives more calories for the heat needed.
And how hot did it need to get?
Immense heat, up to 1,200 degrees Celsius.
Wow. Why so hot? Isn't copper's melting point lower?
It is, but the ore isn't pure copper. It's mixed with other minerals. You need that extra heat to separate everything out properly.
Okay. And getting it that hot.
Yeah.
How? just the charcoal.
No, you needed massive amounts of air forced into the furnace. The estimate is something like 1,600 liters of air per minute.
1,600 liters per minute. How on earth?
It would have taken probably 3 people working bellows constantly, pumping air in for hours on end. Hard, hot work.
Unbelievable. And there was chemistry involved, too.
Oh, yeah, sophisticated stuff. They'd add other materials, like iron oxides.
Why iron?
It acts as a flux. It helps separate the molten copper from the non-copper sulfide minerals, which end up in the waste product, the slag.
Okay, clever. Anything else?
They also added manganese oxides. This actually helped lower the melting temperature of the slag, the waste part, making the whole process a bit safer and more efficient.
So they really knew what they were doing. This wasn't just luck.
Not at all. It was skilled, dangerous, knowledge-intensive work.
Yeah.
After hours of this, they'd have to break the furnace open.
And get the good stuff out.
Yeah. They'd remove the slag, the waste, and be left with this sort of cake of copper metal, usually around 80% pure at this stage.
80% pure, ready to be refined more or used. Amazing.
It really is a whole ancient industry.
Okay, let's connect this ancient site now to broader history, geopolitics even. The sources talk about the names of this place.
Right. Names can tell you a lot. The ancient name seems to have been Ataka.
Ataka. Where does that come from?
It shows up in Egyptian records. Papyrus Harris I, from Ramses III's time, mentions it as part of a major route.
Okay, so it was no.
And it's even mentioned in the biblical book of Samuel as a place King David reigned over. It was clearly seen back then as a major mining hub. The source calls it their version of Palo Alto.
A center of industry and importance. Okay, Attica. What other names?
Then there's the later Arab name, Maniyet.
Maniyat. What does that mean?
It's translated in the sources as meaning cursed, or maybe place to avoid.
Cursed.
There's apparently a local Bedouin story connected to it about a flood or maybe an earthquake that punished wealthy, arrogant people who lived there long ago, supposedly back when the sea reached that far inland. A cautionary tale linked to the place.
Interesting folklore. And the modern name?
The modern name is Timna. That was given much more recently, only about 70 years ago.
Timna. Any significance?
It was named after a biblical figure, actually. Esau had a concubine named Timna.
Okay.
Yeah.
But did she have any actual connection to this place?
None at all, according to the sources. They just picked the name because Timna sounded a bit like the Arabic name Maniyet.
Huh. Just based on sound similarity. Okay.
So names reflecting different eras and perceptions.
Yeah. Shifting gears completely. More recent history. The Suez Canal.
Yeah.
How does that come into play?
Yes. Huge impact. The canal was dug between 1859 and 1869. The British bought a major share in it in 1869.
And it became strategically vital for them.
Absolutely critical. The shortcut to India, China, Australia, the lifeline of the British Empire.
So their policy became...
Keep anyone potentially hostile, mainly the Ottoman Turks, who nominally controlled the area as far away from that canal as possible. Create a buffer zone.
Right. And this led to a specific incident.
It did. In 1906, near Aqaba, which is modern Eilat, right at the top of the Red Sea Gulf there.
What happened?
Well, Lord Cromer, who was running Egypt for the British, was worried about Turkish military activity nearby. He decided to make a statement.
How?
He sent a British officer, a guy named Jennings Bramley, with just 7 men, basically to occupy Aqaba and assert British, well, Egyptian technically, but British-controlled authority.
7 men against the Ottomans.
Yeah. Predictably, they ran into a much larger Ottoman force, maybe 1,000 soldiers, and were quickly pushed back.
Okay, maybe not the best plan, but it got London's attention.
It finally did. That little embarrassment forced London to act. They demanded the Ottomans agree to a formal administrative line, separating Ottoman territory from British-controlled Egypt and Sinai.
Ah, the drawing of a line on the map. How did that go?
The Turks initially proposed a line from Aqaba across to El Arish on the Mediterranean coast.
Okay.
But the British weren't having that. They insisted the line go further west, from Aqaba up to Rafah.
Rafah. Why Rafah?
Crucially, that line was much further away from the Suez Canal, more buffer, and it also ran through less settled, more barren territory, easier to control, less potential friction.
Strategic thinking. So they agreed on Aqaba Rafah.
They did, and the border was marked out with 91 wooden posts just stuck in the ground across the desert.
Wooden posts. That seems temporary.
It kind of highlights a difference in approach mentioned in the sources. The British tended to survey, map, collect data, really know the territory. The Ottoman approach was often more focused on just knowing where they could collect taxes.
Right, different philosophies of bordering.
And, a bit ironically, those wooden posts didn't last long.
What happened to them?
Local Bedouins apparently used them for firewood or building materials over the years.
Oh dear, did that cause problems later?
It did. In later peace negotiations, like between Egypt and Israel, figuring out the exact location of that 1906 line was apparently quite difficult because the physical markers were long gone.
Wow, a forgotten detail with real consequences.
And one other crucial point about that Arab Rafah line, the British made sure the main water sources in the Sinai, like Kadesh Barnea, ended up on their side of the line. Water is key in the desert.
Of course. Smart. Yeah. And that straight, imposed line is quite different from the border with Jordan today.
Yeah, the border with Jordan follows the natural topography more, the deep Rift Valley. The Sinai border is just a line drawn on a map for strategic reasons.
We've covered, wow, such a huge span here.
We really have. From mountains forming millions of years ago
to ancient miners figuring out metallurgy.
Archaeologists debating who is where and when.
And then global politics drawing lines in the sand that still matter today.
It's amazing how looking closely at the sources for just one place, even small details like tool marks or seeds or border posts, can reveal all these incredible layers.
Yeah, it really gives you a shortcut, doesn't it, to understanding how these vastly different scales, deep time and human history and modern events, all intersect.
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's a final thought, something for you listening to maybe mull over after this deep dive.
We saw really clearly how the archaeological facts about Timna, who was mining, exactly when changed dramatically. They were completely overturned based on new evidence, especially carbon dating.
Right. What was accepted truth became pure nonsense.
So the question it raises is this. How much of what we think we know about history, or maybe even about the world around us right now, is just our current best understanding? How much of it is just temporary, waiting to be fundamentally reshaped by the next discovery, the next piece of evidence we haven't found yet?